they developed that, again, like I said last week, if we understand the culture of these three people, we will understand where the Jewish world is today more than in any other way. And these are really the better example to understand where orthodoxy is today in 2020. It's only through the prism and the background of the impact that these three people have had on literally modernity. And it's kind of interesting when you study history, when you meet people whose influence still continues. And those other people who sort of gained the center stage, and therefore we always reckon with them. So let's begin with the oldest of the three, and that's the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, now the Baal Shem Tov, we all know, founder of the Hasidic movement. That's the title that he's given, which no one will deny. The Hasidic movement in a modern sense begins with him. His full name is, anybody remember? His real Hebrew name? Yisrael ben Eliezer. Born somewhere in a tiny village between Podolia and Moldavia, which is like part of the Ukraine, a place called Opaki. And we know very little about him. His entire early life is much shrouded in mystery. In such mystery that all we know about him in this period is he's clearly orphaned early, and suddenly he's a behelfer in a cheder. The behelfer was not even the Malamed.
I would highly encourage everybody to mute themselves to let the rabbi speak.
Guys, I can mute you all, I think, but let's try not to do that, please. Sorry for the disturbance. So he's not even the Malamed, but he's the behelfer. He's the assistant. Married at the age of 18, and then suddenly, within a short time period, looks like not more than a year, his wife died. And next, we find him far from there in a place called Horodenka. We're not even clear why the Baal Shem Tov is there, but the Baal Shem Tov, he's not yet called Baal Shem Tov for quite a while. It's Yisrael ben Eliezer, the Malamed, seems to have spent a tremendous amount of time studying Kabbalistic writings, the Kabbalah of Yitzchak Luria of the Ari, the Kabbalah of Rabbi Chaim Vital of the Ari, and suddenly he's developed a little bit of a following, but he needs to get married. And interestingly, shidduch is pretty cool in the sense that it's the shidduch of the very famous Ephraim of Brody's daughter. Ephraim of Brody was like the rabbi, and somehow he had met the Baal Shem Tov, agreed to give his daughter in marriage, yet by the time the wedding was supposed to take place, Rabbi Ephraim of Brody had passed away. The brother, who's a very famous, and will become famous in the Hasidic movement, a person who was absolutely scared that it was this guy. Who is he? He's not even knowledgeable. How much does he know? He seems to be so private in the things that he does. He was opposed to this marriage. But look, the father had agreed, and Rabbi Gershom of Kittiv was his name. And the Baal Shem Tov, of course, become very close later in life, as suddenly everyone begins to realize that this person is very different. He's a very loving person. He has developed the following because he teaches people all kinds of things. But he's able to talk in the way we speak. He's able to discuss Talmudic sugyot. At the same time, he can talk to the farmer. Talmidei Chachamim did not spend time talking to farmers. What could they learn from farmers unless it was something that related to halacha? And therefore, who would waste time with them? The Baal Shem Tov does. And before you know it, the Baal Shem Tov begins to really develop a following, 20 people, 30 people. And within all these discussions, he becomes friendly with a fellow almost his age, whose name is Dov Ber. Dov Ber of Mezrich. In the interim, the Baal Shem Tov settles in a city called Medjugorje, also within that area. And he really becomes established as the rabbi of the place. Now, I say that because this is something that we're on solid ground about. And let me show you the book. This book by Moshe Rossman, and I'll discuss him again. And the name of the book was The founder of Hasidism, The Quest for the Historical Baal Shem Tov. And Moshe Rossman discovered, he actually went to Poland and spent days there in the library, and they were not very happy with him there. He wanted records of Medjugorje to go back to the census, to the people of the 1700s. And lo and behold, he finds the name. There is the name of the Baal Shem Tov. In fact, on some of the records, he was called in Polish, spelled out, and I can't pronounce it with the Polish letters, Baal Shem Tov. It's clearly that. And clearly he was looked at as the rabbi of the place, not just a follower of some deviant group. He was the rabbi. In fact, the community there and the township had given him the house, which always is normally reserved for the official rabbi that everyone counts. These are a tremendous amount of facts that we did not know about the Baal Shem Tov at all, because some even doubted his existence. Sometimes people wonder, did this person really exist? And today we're on pretty much solid ground. But the Baal Shem Tov continues to develop this friendship with Dov Ber, and Dov Ber is changed by this man. And somewhere around 1736, and I didn't give you his birth date, the Baal Shem Tov was born either, it depends who you ask. Historians tend to make it 1700 exactly. Most have changed it to 1698. Some will say 1699. Chabad, it's 1700 exactly, and they argue that that is the correct date. Mi odea, we don't really have his actual, but by 1736, documented, he's already called the Baal Shem Tov. Now, what is the Baal Shem Tov? In Jewish history, many people, especially in the 1700s, get the title appended to their name of blank Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov was always a person who had a Shem Tov, clearly a good reputation, but it was more than that. He was the master of the name because he knew how to access the power to God's name. To Shem Hashem, how do you pray to God? How do you enunciate and totally, you're the master of the name of God and able to pray to him, to write amulets, to do things, to heal the sick, to help people in real trouble. And that is how the Baal Shem Tov gets depicted in the earliest documents that we have. He's really this charismatic, loving person, spends time, he described always, in the mountains, meditating, thinking, and indeed, he is the Baal Shem Tov. He tells stories. Stresses, by the way, this is such an unfair depiction. Oh, he did not stress learning. He stresses learning. But what he stresses most of all, and this is important about each of the three people that we're about to meet. If you ask the Baal Shem Tov, and like I said last time, if the three people we meet today would be sitting at one table, and the interviewer would turn to the Baal Shem Tov and say, tell me, Mr. Baal Shem Tov, what is the most important teacher you can teach anybody? And he would say, dveikut, or dveikus, or dveikus. And what did that mean to him? It's a concept of attachment. It's an attachment to God constantly. And he clearly, without a doubt, put that into prayer. So if you ask the Baal Shem Tov, what is the most important thing you need to do? To him, it was prayer. Dveikus, attach yourself to God. It's almost as if the Baal Shem Tov did not believe in evil. Evil was really something really good covered up by some husks that needed to be removed, and you needed how to remove them. And the only way to remove them was absolutely through love. If you peel away whatever is there in the evil, eventually you'll see the love. And about 10 years later, in 1747, this is in his own handwriting, the Baal Shem Tov's document. And there's not much in his own handwriting. In fact, there's almost nothing except for a number of letters, most addressed to his brother-in-law. The Baal Shem Tov describes, and put your seats on for a minute because it is a little bit incredulous for the modern mind to comprehend this, but he deeply believed in this, that he ascended heaven. So 1747, on Rosh Hashanah, he was able to go up to heaven, and he meets Mashiach. And he says to him exactly the same line that's found in the Talmud, a story in Masechet Sanhedrin, when one of the Chachamim sees Mashiach in the gates of Rome. And the question was asked in the Gemara, Ematai ka'atimar? When is the master coming? So lo and behold, the Baal Shem Tov in this letter says, I turned to Mashiach and I said to Mashiach, when will you come? And Mashiach said, I'll give you a sign. And the sign is when Yafutza Mayanatecha Chutza, when your teachings will be spread all over the world, which are, and now Mashiach tells him, Ahavat Hashem, the love of God, Ahavat Israel, the love of a Jew, and the third thing, of course, Ahavat HaTorah. When these three things, you will teach the world and spread your teachings of whatever your philosophy is, Mashiach will come. And that's clearly the premise that the entire Hasidic movement is built on initially. If every one of his followers, and they numbered so many, do they all practice the all three? Do they all write about three? The answer is overall yes, but which one they emphasize more, kind of hard to tell. But Ahavat Israel, Ahavat Hakom Dveikut, loving God for sure, but loving every Jew, and every Jew meant literally, this is in his writing, straight out.
You
Every
please
Jew.
mute, please.
Irrelevant, who needs to be muted? Let's mute them. Okay, thank you. Irrelevant of the Jews' status of being religious or not religious, being knowledgeable or not knowledgeable. Every Jew needs to be loved. Every Jew needs to be respected. And then the Baal Shem Tov included this absolutely important concept of simcha that permeates all the Hasidic movement. And the Hasidic movement built on the Baal Shem Tov taught simcha, joy is the greatest thing, and joy at all times. Now, this causes an upside down world. Part of it will include the idea of making a l'chaim, the idea of turning a yard site, which until the Hasidic movement was a fast day, into having a tikkun or giving a l'chaim. The idea of a tish, sitting down with the Rebbe and dancing. This was unheard of. You did it with your family maybe, a couple of times a year, maybe on Sukkot, because it's Man Simchatenu. The Hasidic movement now spreads like wildfire. And I'm not entering into the details why it became so popular, what were the issues in the communities, simply always explain, but again, it's too simple to explain, that the only people who were being paid attention to, the only people who were respected, were the Talmidei Chachamim, the elites of Torah learning. They sat in the front, they were respected, people sought them out. They were quite distant from the people because they spent their day in the Bet HaMidrash. There's a new leader in town. His name is Baal Shem Tov. He teaches joy. He teaches love. He teaches respect for every Jew. He actually extended, and it was the Baal Shem Tov who said it first, that every blade of grass is imbued by God's movement. So when the blade of grass blows, which the Rambam said, and many Jewish philosophers, oh, that's the forces of nature. God does not care which blade of grass blows which way. The Baal Shem Tov says, no, God wants it to blow this way. So God was now infused in all these things. 1760, on Shavuot, actually, it will be the Baal Shem Tov's yahrzeit on the second day of Shavuos. The Baal Shem Tov told his followers, who by now had turned into hundreds of his followers. The movement spreads now and passes on to his good friend, Dov Ber of Mezrich, who continues this movement. But Dov Ber of Mezrich is the one who you can say had all the great students that will follow, like the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, the Kedusha, all the great Hasidic masters that I'm not mentioning, and it's not a lecture on Hasidism and their leaders. But they all study with Dov Ber. Dov Ber of Mezrich continues constantly quoting teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, and suddenly this movement has caught fire. And wait a second, who are these people? And what do? Well, they institute a lot of changes beyond the small things about suddenly turning a fast day of a yahrzeit into a l'chaim and into eating and to giving food. But their influence changes the siddur. Suddenly Ashkenazi davening for Ashkenazim for hundreds of years goes out the window. It's Nusach Hari, which is basically Nusach Sfard davening, and a bunch of other things I'll get to in a minute. But the movement started. Exactly what happens in 1772, the year that Dov Ber dies, when they're placed in Cherem. I'll get to that in a minute. In the interim, the movement has spread, and it's here to stay. Exactly what the movement is today, who knows? Now, one of the other concepts that the Hasidic movement begins clearly with the Baal Shem Tov, but more enunciated with Dov Ber, is the concept of a tzaddik. There is within each Hasidic sect, leader, group, and all the ones that follow, and you all know Hasidic groups from, just throw out names, from Chabad, obviously the most famous one, to Sadigara, Ger, Kotsk, Bobev, Pupus, Satmar, all with Munkach, with literally thousands of followers today the world over. All of them trace back to these two people, to Dov Ber of Mezrich or to the Baal Shem Tov, but all have this concept of a tzaddik. That role of the one person in each community who you could go talk to, who might not necessarily be the greatest Talmid Chacham in Halacha. And usually they were, but that was not their function. For that, you went to the Rav. So in towns where they're both tolerated, and I'll explain that in a minute, you had the Rav, the one who decided Halacha, and then you had the Rebbe. The Rebbe was the one who you went to advice with. Should I do this? Should I do that? I'm having issues with my wife. I'm having issues with God. I'm angry at God. Come talk to me. Let's discuss it. So that role of the tzaddik was really something new. And the movement goes on. I do not exaggerate, but clearly the influence of the Hasidic movement has created a literature that has produced to this day over 20,000 serious volumes of writing. It is a movement that is still being studied. There are scholars of this movement who get a living out of discussing what the Baal Shem Tov and his students and the next generation and the next generation had built. And even though the Holocaust came and destroyed much of Hasidic courts and their beauty, the Hasidic movement, thank God, has rebuilt. And it's out there. All this was the Baal Shem Tov. So let's put the Baal Shem Tov a little bit on the back burner. I'll come back to him. but I know some of you keep on emailing me if good books to recommend about some of the things that I speak about. Now, look at this book. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Hasidism, A New History, with an afterword by Arthur Green. It has 8 scholars who worked on this volume for years. It was just published about not even 2 years ago yet. It is without a doubt the heaviest book that you could buy. It's been weighed in the reviews when you read about it. It's close to 5 pounds, but it is a full, revised, up-to-date history of everything Hasidic, including Hasidic music, Shlomo Karbach, Mordechai Ben David, the Hasidic courts today across the world, where they are. It starts with the Baal Shem Tov and clearly gives you the latest scholarship. So if you want to know everything about the Hasidic movement, you need not purchase anything else today. You can buy this book. It was published by Princeton University Press, and it received amazing reviews. It's got great pictures, never before. I don't make a penny of it, but that Moshe Rossman, who I mentioned, has his articles all in here that are important, of course, revised with more scholarship. So if you're really into it now, I would love to tell you, recall in your mind what the Baal Shem Tov looked like. The only problem is the picture you'll Google and see, and you might have had in your sikkah of the Baal Shem Tov, is not the Baal Shem Tov. It is a Baal Shem Tov. We do not have a picture of the Baal Shem Tov. Irrelevant that you'll see that same picture all around wherever you want. That is a picture of the Baal Shem Tov of London, also a Baal Shem Tov, and somehow someone confused Baal Shem, London, Shmundon, whatever, it's the Baal Shem, and therefore they published this book called, the picture Baal Shem Tov. It's not the Baal Shem Tov. So again, let's just review. If you ask the Baal Shem Tov, what's the number one thing in your life? It is dveikut. It's praying. It's staying attached to God. Daven to Hashem all day long. Just open your mind. Talk to God. Talk to God about this, the mundane. When you're plowing your field, whatever you're doing, just talk to God. That is what God wants of you. Does he want me to sit and learn? Learning is important, but dveikut is more important. And that is an innovation in a sense, the shifting of, Torah and Tefillah. Now Chazal had them both as important. And again, Talmud Torah was Keneged Kulam, the greatest. Yes, it's the greatest, but you've got to do this first and understand dveikut. And if you don't learn that way, your learning is just an intellectual level. The Baal Shem Tov would say that's not good. So let's put the Baal Shem Tov on a back burner, low fire, let it simmer. And let's meet our next personality. And that's none other, if you remember, than the Gaon of Vilna. So the Gaon of Vilna was born in 1720. So if we do the math, just to put it in perspective, the Baal Shem Tov died at the age of 61. And when the Baal Shem Tov was roughly about 20 years old, the Gaon of Vilna is born, not far from Vilna, again in 1720. And if I say this was a child prodigy, I cannot exaggerate, because the Baal Shem Tov clearly loved his own, and no one said he knew everything by heart, and he never claimed he did. The Gaon of Vilna, it is testified by reliable people that at the age of 6, and I wrote it down here, at the age of 6, he was pretty conversant in most of Torah and Mishnah. By the age of 9, he knew all the Gemara. He was capable at the age of 9 of studying 140 dapim in half an hour. At the age of 10, he has supposedly mastered the Zohar and the writings of the Ari. By the age of 12, he had taught himself the 7 sciences of logic, rhetoric, grammar, music, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic. Now, one of his students, the famous Pad HaShulchan, which I'll mention later, in his introduction to that book called Pad HaShulchan, says something interesting, that he actually wanted to become a medical student. The Gaon of Vilna was interested in medicine and wanted to go to medical school. And people from Poland again went to Padua. But his father discouraged him and pushed him to return to study the Talmud. And this young man who knows it all, and no one disputes that, and it's quite evident from anything the man has touched, becomes a genius to such a degree that there is nothing he doesn't know. In fact, let me read to you from one of the earliest biographies written about him. It describes a maskil, and we'll discuss that too in a minute, an enlightened Jew who had issues with halakha and Torah, who wanted to set up the Gaon, whose name was, you know, in the Haskalah literature, is Abba of Glusk. And Abba of Glusk wanted to come to Vilna, and he does, and argue the point, something that had to do with Rashi actually, if Rashi really gave the explanation of the best simple meaning, the pshat. And he wanted to come and ask these questions to absolutely show that the Gaon really doesn't know much. And he prepared all these questions. So let me read to you his actual description. He said, he entered, and the Gaon of Vilna spoke in Hebrew and asked me, okay, what are your questions? I posed one of my heretical questions, and I wanted to see what he would say. He thought for a minute, and then the Gaon asked me, what else do you want to ask? And I asked more questions. While he was immersed in thought for a moment, I too considered what else I might ask him and posed a whole many great questions to him. When I saw he had not responded even to my first question, I stopped and said, these are all my questions. Believe me, he writes, I was shaken to hear as he began to speak. And he said to me, although your questions in total are 73 in number, they are in reality only 15 questions, because the first and the 7th, the 25th and the 47th are really one question in the same category. And he proceeded to subdivide and sort into categories all the numerous diverse questions, not omitting one from the list. What a remarkable feat of wisdom beyond human comprehension. I considered how I might answer and challenge his words, because he answered them. I said, perhaps you'll object because of this. The Gaon replied, you didn't understand my words. Listen again to what I said. He didn't add a word to his second time. He repeated the answer, and I realized that in a short reply, he covered every contradiction. Then again, I tried. And again, he repeated with the next question that I had, all the possible arguments. And I realized that among all the scholars of the nation, there is absolutely no one comparable to him. In Vilna, it was quite early that the Gaon of Vilna, the few times he had spoken, and he was not much of a public person, the Gaon of Vilna said to the community, every one of you should study one Masechet of Gemara. Take one tractate of the Talmud, review it well, and just review it over and over and over again. Why? Because this way, when you have nothing to do, you could orally review. You don't always have a book with you. You might not have an iPad or Rabbeinu Google to see or find, Safari, one of the great tools out there to study Talmud, or an art scroll. Know it by heart, because no matter where you are, you can walk on the streets, cross the street, you review the Talmud. And one person who wrote this down says, I decided to learn Masechet Sukkah, and I'll review it. And this man sat there for 2-3 years, studied Masechet Sukkah, and then he decided next time he sees the Gaon of Vilna to actually tell him. And he meets the Gaon of Vilna, and he interrupts him. He was afraid, he writes, and he says to him, you know, I studied Masechet Sukkah, I now know it very well. And the Gaon of Vilna said, oh, you know it very well? Yeah, I know it by heart. And the Gaon of Vilna said, can I ask you a question? And of course, ask me, as long as it's a Masechet Sukkah, not to worry. I will absolutely answer you because I know it by heart. And the Gaon of Vilna's first question was, tell me all the places where Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree, and what do they disagree about? And tell me every page where Rav Ashi is mentioned and what Rav Ashi says. And he proceeded to realize he just memorized something by heart with that. So what point I'm trying to make to the story is the knowledge that Gaon of Vilna displayed and clearly knew is not just a superficial conglomerate of a whole assembly of information in his head. The Gaon of Vilna, in a second, almost like scanning a computer. You know, and I said this before, some of you might remember this, but there are many Jews, including some of us, who can recite Ashrei. Go ahead, say Ashrei. Yeah, I can say Ashrei on either siddur. Many of us can say Shmon Esrei. Well, can you say it backwards? Can you say it from the middle to the beginning? Can you tell me how many aleph are in Ashrei? How many gimel, daled, etc. are in Ashrei? And that's the Gaon of Vilna. He, clear knowledge, just superseded all this with a depth of understanding. And this depth of understanding was not only in the Talmud, it was in all of Judaic literature. Sifra, Sifrei, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Kabbalah. He also read any book in Hebrew that had been written in his time or before, and there were many, with scientific issues, things that had to do with astronomy. He had read them, like Chunot Haaretz and the earlier books that describe whatever science of the time was known. The Gaon absorbed those books and they were in his library. By the way, his son, Avraham, he had two sons, he actually had three sons. His son, Avraham, actually wrote down all the books and manuscripts the Gaon of Vilna had, and he would just like read through them. Now, he doesn't teach anybody, not at least until the age of 40, marries at the age of 18 to Hannah, a very faithful, devoted wife who understood that this was not your regular Talmid Chacham husband, because literally within a year after being married, the Gaon of Vilna disappears for 8 years. Where he actually is, scholars debate. He obviously goes in what we call golus. Many scholars did this. They would go into exile by themselves, wander from place to place to find people of knowledge to discuss, just to see how the world is, be away from home and feel the pain of the exile, whatever reason people did that. I'm not sure anyone recommends this as a healthy way of doing things today, or even at that point, but the Gaon of Vilna left for the next 8 years. And some will claim, and with good testimony, he went to Berlin, Amsterdam for sure he went to. What did he actually do? Some will tell you he went into libraries, checked manuscripts of Jewish content. Mi Yodea. Now he returns 8 years later, and only by the time he reaches 40, the Gaon of Vilna begins to teach people. Now he doesn't teach in a shul openly. There's no shiurim the Gaon of Vilna ever gives. He will learn with certain people individually. In the meantime, he annotates, literally annotates every piece of every book of everything he reads, annotates the Talmud, corrects the Talmud. Every word, every page is checked. On the side, he'd write his comments. Kabbalistic works, he'll sit down and write commentaries to the Zohar, for the Tzniuta of the Zohar, to Tikkunei Zohar. and profusely writing, producing thousands of pages. By the way, when he dies, his family, the community argue about who should own or who does own the writings of the Gaon of Vilna, which, by the way, to this day, have not all published. His students claim he wrote about 70 books, only about 50 have been published. Commented on everything. But the comments in Kabbalah are very clear. The comments everywhere else, you need someone to actually help you with them. And the Gaon of Vilna is not involved in any way, shape, or form in the community. Here and there, they need him for something, he'll come, he'll figure it out, but he's not getting involved in political issues. He literally sits and learns all day long. In addition, you should know, he actually produces books of math. You can search on Hebrew books for the Ayal Mishulash. Let me just dig it up and show it to you. So you can just for a second see it up there. I don't want to share screen and just interrupt the lecture. And here, for example, if you see it, I'll put it right in front. Here is his math book. And the Ayal Mishulash, again, dealing with the triangle initially, is actually about, if you can see the word is algebra from the Gaon of Vilna. So he writes this book, literally knowledgeable of all things. But lo and behold, when we peel away of his schedule, which his children describe to us, he hardly slept, not more than 2 hours a night, and stayed up. In the day, he never slept more than half an hour. He had his feet in a basin of water as not to fall asleep, constantly making sure that he was learning. And this is not a judgmental call, but in the introduction to his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, called the Beur of the Grad, to the Shulchan Aruch, which I'll get to in a minute. His children write of his extraordinary diligence in learning, almost superhuman. And then they say the following. Let us tell you how our father was deeply connected to learning. They say the story that one of our brother, our oldest brother, Shlomo Zalman, who did not live long, ben Chamesh Shanim, when he was, I'll just give you the English, when he was 5 or 6 years old, and my father loved him very much because he saw what a beautiful child he was and his beautiful character. One point, he said, these brothers are writing about their older brother years later when their father had died and the commentary was being published. You can find this in the Shulchan Aruch in the beginning. It says Haktamat. You see there Abraham ben Harambam, ben Eliyahu, and Yehuda Leib, Arya Leib, the other son, the two sons who outlived, obviously, their father. Shlomo Zalman had not. And our brother got ill, and my father loved him very much. Yet, what had happened when he was very ill, my father already had agreed that he would go on one of his exiles, and he would travel about 7 kilometers away from Vilna. And our brother was ill. The next morning, he got up and he left. And he went to that place, laid boded, as he does come up on him. And he sat there and he learned, and he says, they write, our father was away for more than a month, and he totally forgot about us. And then they tell us, because he told them, Pamachat, during this time period when he was away, the 29th day or so, he went to a bathhouse. In the bathhouse, the children write, for sure he wasn't thinking and learning. And there where he wasn't thinking and learning, he remembered in this car that there's a kid home that's not feeling well. And he had now left for a month. Immediately, he got a wagon and came home. His grandchildren tell us, not out of disrespect and not out of love, that he never inquired about them. Not how they're doing and what they're doing. The conversations were tiny and small. And the Gaon of Vilna point is, and you all remember the story because I used it in another lecture for a different point, but the Gaon of Vilna's sister had come to visit him. He had not seen her in 52 years. And he was sitting and learning, and by now in Vilna, he had his own little klois, his own little room in the shul there, where he would hear the davening, and if people would ever meet him, they would meet him in this private room, which was built for him. And they tell him, Rabbeinu, sorry to interrupt, and people would be afraid to knock on his door. They tell him, Rabbeinu, your sister's here. And he said to the person who opened the door, tell her, look, my beard is gray. Tell her I love her, and my best regards to her, but I have to keep on learning. And the Gaon just went on learning. None of these stories are written by the children out of spite or hate. It's a description they have for their father's full attention to learning Torah. Don't yet draw a comparison between the Gaon of Vilna and the Baal Shem Tov, which maybe in your mind you're doing, but here is a person who has made up his mind to acquire the deepest learning possible. He has no time for people. Okay, he even writes in the letter, sometimes going to shul is very dangerous because instead of davening, all we do is we speak Lashon Hara. We look at the way people are dressed. Like, what's the point of all this? So maybe even advised his wife, maybe sometimes it's better to stay home and daven than go to shul and socialize and do the wrong thing. So lo and behold, the fame of the Gaon of Vilna has now spread. Everyone has heard about him. Everyone turns to him with letters of halakhic inquiries. Everyone wants to know. In Vilna itself, he becomes the pride of Vilna, and his most prized possession as a student is the very famous Chaim of Volozhin, who did not spend much time with him, yet he calls himself a student. Again, these are not students that spend years learning. These are students who spent hours. Even a particular student, Mendel of Shklov, writes that he spent 6 months with the Gaon. Now, 6 months with the Gaon meant he was there in Vilna for 6 months, and every other day, the Gaon would give him a set of time. And he would enter the Gaon, and together, somehow it was this person was responsible for the Gaon's commentary to Mishlei. Because in this short time period, the Gaon dictated his commentary to Mishlei to him. Begin to realize what a human being this is and how everyone was so proud of him. And now he becomes a role model for many. His motto at the table, when asked by the interviewer, what's most important to you? What the Gaon of Vilna would say, learning Torah. How about davening? It's important, but there's nothing greater than learning Torah. You want to connect to God, you will not connect through prayer. You will connect to God through learning. When you use your mind to understand the laws of God, to understand the words of God, in all the different, call them displays of Talmud, learning Chumash, learning Halakha, learning Kabbalah, that is by using the intellect, very Maimonidean in a sense. That's how you'll get to understand God. Now, in the Gaon's lifetime, and now we'll connect it to the other person, and I'll come back to it in a minute in a different way. In the Gaon's lifetime, the other movement that developed, besides the Hasidic movement, which I'll get to in a second, is the Haskalah movement. Call it the period of enlightenment. And the period of enlightenment actually begins with the personality of Moshe Mendelssohn. Now, Moses Mendelssohn Moshe Mendelssohn, whatever you want to call him, was born in 1729, just to give you the comparison. So just remember, Baal Shem Tov, 1700s to 1760, the Gaon of Vilna, 1720 to 1797. So the Gaon of Vilna dies on Sukkot at the age of 77. The Baal Shem Tov died at the age of 61. But now let's meet Moses Mendelssohn. Moshe Mendelssohn is born in 1729. So if you start doing the math, it's when the Baal Shem Tov is 29, Mendelssohn is born. When the Gaon of Vilna is 9 years old, Mendelssohn is born. Yet Mendelssohn will only live till 1786, roughly about 57 or so years. Moshe Mendelssohn, the son of Menachem Mendel, a sofer, was born in the city of Dessau, studies with the rabbi of Dessau, the very famous David Frankel, who is the author of the Pnei David and the Yerushalmi. If you open up any copy of the Yerushalmi, you'll see two commentaries. One side, the text in the middle, will say the Pnei David or Pnei David, or the Karban Eda. So the Pnei David was written by David Frankel, who studies Torah with Mendelssohn. At the age of 14, this Rabbi Frankel gets the position of the chief rabbi of Berlin. At that point, Mendelssohn leaves home, travels with this rabbi to Berlin to learn there. Now, something important. Jews could not live in Berlin. They needed actual permission. In many cases, royal permission from Frederick III, I believe it was. Now, because he was the chief rabbi, his students in his yeshiva could come with him. So that's how Mendelssohn comes here. Years later, once he's no longer in the yeshiva, I'll get to that in a minute. So Mendelssohn, also brilliant, studies Torah, knows it all, begins to study Latin, Greek, French, obviously German and Hebrew he knew fluently. He knew English fluently well too. French, again, all these languages, begins to study books of philosophy, and he reads German very well. Let's remind ourselves some of the great philosophers in Germany in this time period, already influenced by Descartes, if you remember your philosophies, is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is a drop, it's pretty much the same dates as Mendelssohn, lives a drop longer. He knows Mendelssohn. In fact, he was afraid of Mendelssohn, and clearly he was influenced by Mendelssohn. But Mendelssohn suddenly makes friends in Berlin with a fellow whose name was Gerhard Ephraim Lessing. Lessing is what you would call a German humanist. Christian, obviously, but he loves Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's so smart, and he pushes Mendelssohn to publish. And Mendelssohn, in German, without a name, sends in articles to a journal of philosophy. And clearly it gets accepted. Okay, publishes a second one, a third one, a fourth one. But no one knows who's the author of these pretty important philosophical papers, some of them taking on philosophers of earlier and making quite important arguments. And it's this Lessing who eventually pushes him and tells people, you know who this is? This is that fellow, that short fellow who's always hunchback because from birth, Moses Mendelssohn had a spine condition, and if you've ever seen pictures of what he looked like and stuff, a little bit bent out of shape always, but always with his yarmulke, and that's how he walked around. And lo and behold, it's the Jew. And at this point, because he wanted to live in Berlin, the king gives him permission because look at, now Lessing later on in life will write a play about him. Some of you might remember, very famous play, Nathan the Wise. You can go Google it. productions of Nathan the Wise have been put on even recently. And Nathan the Wise in this story by Lessing, who also was a dramatist, he wrote plays, is none other than Nathan the Wise, Moses Mendelssohn. The beauty of this entire discussion of Mendelssohn is that here is Mendelssohn, who you could say is and I say this advisedly, but with a real sense of understanding history. Mendelssohn, in a sense, is the first modern Orthodox Jew. He lives in Germany. He lives in German society. He loved German society. He deeply respected it. And he's out there. Yet, he is a Shomer Torah and Mitzvot. Does he spend all his day learning? No, he doesn't. But he spends his day in philosophy whenever he can, yes. Around the age of 32, 34, roughly, he marries. There are 6 children. He marries Frumit Guggenheim, also a very supportive wife. And then suddenly, he's given an award around 1763 by the Prussian Academy of Sciences or something. So here's a Jew who accepts it, who walks in there proud to be a Jew, knowledgeable in all things. This is the time period where people were fighting for human rights for everybody. Soon, 1770, the French Revolution will come and emancipation for people. And how will the Jews in Germany be looked at? And clearly, Mendelssohn was pushing very much on every issue. Now, he never ignored his community when there were issues in the community that he could help with because he was connected in high places. He got involved and tried to do things. He actually, around 17 something, I forget the actual date, before he was married, a year before he was married, he actually traveled to get smicha from Jonathan Eibeshutz, who didn't give him smicha in the end, who wrote him a letter of, look, I'm sorry. And the dilemma is quite clear. We don't know why. But by then, here comes this fellow from Germany who is so knowledgeable in philosophy in Germany. Everyone respects him. He wants smicha, title of rabbi. He just back and didn't give it to him. Yeah, he said, look, I can't give you that title, but I'll give you the title chaver, which is still a title of high honor given in that time period. And then Mendelssohn gets involved against his will in a challenge. What had happened is, and I'll make it short, but it's fabulous. A French theologian, Charles Bonnet, had written a book about, and I'll oversimplify it, about Christianity and how important it is. Someone translated that book into German, parts of it, a fellow by the name of Lavater. And Lavater, who knew Mendelssohn from Berlin, decided to do something quite tricky. As he translates this book by Bonnet on the values of Christianity, he decided to dedicate the book in every possible way to Moses Mendelssohn. So here's a book about Christianity and why it's important. And on the cover page, Lavater, who translated a book into German, now Lavater lived in Zurich in Switzerland at that point, translates the book and says, to my good friend, Moses Mendelssohn, this book I dedicate, and I hope you read it, but I offer you a challenge. Disprove it. If not, do the right thing and agree with it. And Mendelssohn, for the next few years, was involved in it upset him terribly. He suffered from it. He produced nothing in this time period. He had to sit there, and the most apologetic, nice letters would be written. Of course, the intention was for him to convert. What greater victory for the Christian humanists in Germany to be able to say that the greatest mind, in fact, they called him the Jewish Socrates. That was his title. Here's this Jewish Socrates who now converts to Christianity. And Mendelssohn publishes tiny letters, like getting out of it. Finally, and I'll read you one line that he says in this last, he says, I am completely convinced of the immutability of my religion, as you or Mr. Bonnet are sure of yours. And I hereby attest before the God of truth, the Creator who sustains you and me. I shall always continue to hold my beliefs for as long as my soul does not change its nature. The distance from your religion, of which I informed you and your friends, has not lessened since then. And it's not bothering me. And somehow this whole issue slows down. But in the meantime, German intellectual giants got involved here, like let Mendelssohn be Mendelssohn. But everyone begins to say, look at Mendelssohn. If Mendelssohn is so smart, maybe the rest of the Jews are too. We just haven't given them a chance. We've limited their rights. Maybe if we allow them rights, they can all shine like Mendelssohn does. Mendelssohn, by the way, corresponds with the great poskim at the time, like Rabbi Yaakov Emden, about an issue that happened in one of the German cities that Mendelssohn was asked to involve in, where they forbade burial for 3 days. What had happened in that locality is that a number of people were buried very quickly, not Jewish, but who were not dead. So therefore, a local ordinance was issued that once a person dies, let's wait for 3 days. And of course, he had his ideas. He wrote to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. You can check it out. It's in Chelek Gimel, I believe, is Siman Mem Hey, and so on. But in spite of all this, which I have not discussed at all, Mendelssohn's main contribution, forget about the philosophy, was to the Jewish people. It's in the last years of his life that he writes the book called Jerusalem, about Jewish philosophy and what Judaism was all about. That it's a religion built on reason. It's a revealed religion based on reason, not coercion, which means his understanding of why we do mitzvot is not because God is making you do it. It's because you use your seichel and understand the great part of what Jewish religion is all about. When Mendelssohn dies, quite young, everyone comes to his funeral. And now if we just step out a drop, and I know we're almost out of time, but allow me 5 more minutes and then I'll bring it all together. What had happened in the interim is that in 1772, the Hasidic movement had become so popular that the Gaon of Vilna was asked to place them in excommunication or in cherem. And the Gaon of Vilna signed the cherem in 1772, describing what he felt were the 11 reasons that were listed, if you collect them all, it's 5 main ones of what the Hasidim were doing wrong, which absolutely required their excommunication. First of all, they broke with tradition in a number of issues. Who in the world dared change Nusachat Tefillah? The rabbis made it very clear that you have to stick to what your Nusachat Tefillah is. You can't just today Sfar, tomorrow Ashkenaz. Whatever your minhag is, minhagim are strong. Hasidim just uprooted it. They just changed and speak of dveikut. What kind of stuff is this? They worship human beings, the tzaddikim, as great people. Just not doable. It was the Hasidic movement, and by the way, if there are any men up there on the few screens I can actually see, how many of you do not put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed? How many of you put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed? If you don't put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed, you're of Hasidic stock. In the Ashkenazi world, it was unheard of not to wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed. Yes, in the Sephardi world, different story. In the Ashkenazi world, you wore tefillin on Chol Hamoed. So any of the stuff that you do, whether you know it or not, you come from Hasidic stock unless you had no particular minhag and you adopted one. But they were put in cherem. And this got into a very ugly fight. But if you now go and look at our Jewish world in retrospect, you have three people here. And these three people are literally the models of who we are today. In our Jewish world in particular, you'll have the Hasidic movement, who still looks to the Baal Shem Tov. And yes, the Hasidic movement influenced the descendants of the Gaon of Vilna. And yes, the descendants of the Gaon of Vilna and the followers influenced the Hasidic movement. But the beauty of the Hasidic movement has spilled off today in every element of Jewish life. And I find it kind of so funny when, oh, let's have a tish. Like, let's have a tish, you know? And there's a tish in the Reform movement. They're having a tish. How did that get there? But that's all under the influence of this wonderful movement. The number one student of the Gaon of Vilna, Chaim of Volozhin, in 1802, starts the first yeshiva, the first yeshiva in Poland and Volozhin. Before 1802, there are no yeshivot the way we and I understand them today. Yeshivot did not exist. In every town, there was a group of people who sat and learned. Small group, again, if you remember like the Polish model. The cheder till the age of 12, 13, then you stop learning. The great, wonderful minds, 10 kids at most, went more. Beyond that, you went to the Bet Midrash or to the Klois. And they were not huge, and that's it. The idea of sitting and learning on the masses did not exist. It all comes as a result of the influence of this period. When Chaim of Volozhin, based on the instructions of the Gaon of Vilna in 1802, starts that yeshiva, that is a huge yeshiva. It stayed open till 1892 when the Netziv had to close it for whatever reason, also debatable. Every model of yeshiva today has followed the Volozhin yeshiva. Hasidic yeshivas didn't start till like 1870s or something, much later. But today, every yeshiva is a replica of the yeshiva of the Gaon of Vilna. In the yeshiva world, sitting and learning is the most important thing. Sometimes at the expense of davening. I'm learning now. I'll daven, don't worry. In the Hasidic world, it's the other way around. It's time to daven. We go daven. These were two separate personalities. And if you think of it, it's not shocking. Our Jewish world always existed that way. Think back, there was Moshe and there was Aaron, two different personalities. Aaron was the Rodev Shalom, that different. Moshe was the judge, the tough guy. You had Shammai and Hillel. And if you go through all of Jewish history, there's always the Chassid and the Chacham. And the Chassid and the Chacham somehow try to, but suddenly the modern world comes in, which threatens both. How do you react to it? And that's we in our Jewish modern Orthodox world today. How do we deal with things? Mendelssohn was the first person who had to deal with it. And granted, his life was tragic because at the end of the day, he lived in the German world. He admired it. He spoke of its beauty. He thought that it's this world of the German culture that will eventually accept the Jews and give them rights. And to a certain point, they begin to do that much after Mendelssohn. But we all know, about 150 years after Mendelssohn, what the German people did to the Jewish people. So, you know, his journey ended up tragic in so many ways, yet he was that pioneer who tried. And therefore, when we look at these three people and we look at our world today, we begin to get some glimpse of how we got here. So it's clearly the influence of these three people, including the Gaon of Vilna, who, by the way, put the Hasidim in cherem, but never put the Maskilim in cherem. And that's a whole different lecture. And again, I want to thank Beth Jacob. I'm sorry I went like 7 minutes overtime. And with Hashem's help, we'll continue these whenever the next happens, and thank you for being there. If you have any questions, I see there was something in the chat. I
Outstanding.
haven't looked at them.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Fabulous, Esther.
Thank you.
Great.
You're welcome.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you
Enjoy
so much.
everybody, and thank you, everybody. And Ann Winter, if you're out there, thanks for everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, too.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there any precedent of one person being able to put people in Cherem? Doesn't have to be a Besdin or something?
It wasn't he alone. The Gaon of Vilna, together with the Bet Din of Vilna, and already the Cherem there had been a Cherem issued in the city of Brody already by the Bet Din there. So when I say Gaon of Vilna, he was the main signator on it, not exactly a single one. I apologize if I made that impression.
Is it correct that Mendelssohn personally was observant, was essentially a Furma Yid?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
In fact, if you have nothing to do, you can see if you can find the 1986 edition. Again, which issue of it was 1986 that the Jewish Observer of the Aguda
Yes.
published an article basically saying that there was something to study in his life. And then if you remember, there was
It blew up.
controversy in the next issue,
Yes,
et cetera, and much came of that.
I remember that. Thank you. Yes.
There was a big
Anybody
controversy.
else?
It was a big controversy over his biur, can you or can't you? And apparently a lot of people studied it sub rosa.
Yeah, I didn't even get to his Be'er. Clearly his Be'er was intended to spread German language and get rid of Yiddish. But yet his Be'er was absolutely faithful to the Masorah. He quoted basically Rashi most of the time, here and there, other commentators. So it's quoted by many Chachamim, the Be'er. The Ksava Kabbalah, if you look at it, will quote Moshe of Desva from his Be'er. So the Mendelssohn's Be'er was studied.
It was referred to as Ramad, Ramoshe Desra.
Yeah.
Be well.
Be well, guys. Good night. And thank you. Again, I apologize for going overtime. Hashem should be with all of you. Next time in Yerushalayim,
Thank-
Barak